All right. Good evening. Let's get started. For tonight's class, let's talk about speech. They tell the story of the young couple. They're married just a couple of months, and the man comes home from work one day after a long day in the office, and he walks into the house and he notices that there's a note on the fridge. And the note reads as follows: "I'm sorry, but it's just not working anymore. I'm at my parents' house." You see, for the past few months, they've been having a lot of difficulties in their relationship. At least she was experiencing the difficulties. He kind of was clueless, to say the least. So as he picks up the note from the fridge, he opens up the fridge, sticks his head inside, says, "Hey, it's cold." Pulls out a beer, sits down on the couch, starts drinking the beer, and texts his wife. "You said it's not working. The fridge is working just fine." You see, this is the pity of communication or speaking. Sometimes we master the art of speaking, but fail at communication. See, as human beings, we are called, our sages call us the medaber. You see, there are four types of existences, essentially. There's the daimim, which is the inanimate objects. There's the tzemeach, which is vegetation. There's the chai, which is animal life. And there is medaber, the human being. We are communicators by nature, but not just those who speak and share information, but we communicate ideas. We communicate lessons, important things. You see, we know that wars can be started just based on a miscommunication. Relationships are founded on healthy communication, not just speaking, but communicating. Now, is it just about what we say, or is it the mode that we say it as well? I'm just going to share my screen with you. Enjoy the PowerPoint. See, what can the Torah tell us about communication, proper communication, healthy communication? So just from looking at the Torah from a general scope, there's a lot that we can learn about communication. First thing, every minor detail in the Torah contains a lesson, which teaches us a lot about communication. Communication is not just in the big picture things, but also in the small pictures. You see, you can read through the Torah and get very distracted by every big story, very large story. But you can lose the little nuances that come here and there, or even little details within a story that often get overlooked. Tonight, we're going to be discussing one of those stories, and that is the story of the Great Flood. A person can become very distracted just by the general narrative of the story of the Great Flood, without looking at the little details that can teach us some very valuable lessons. And that's in general with communication. Little nuanced details mean the world when it comes to communicating. Secondly, we see how careful the Torah is when it comes to using speech, the primacy of language. We know that the Torah has prohibitions on slander, lashon hara, ona'as dvarim, which means verbally attacking or offending somebody, and how we have to regulate our speech in ways when it relates to potentially adversely effects on others. So we see the Torah holds very highly of speech, but how careful we must be with it. Let's take a look from where it all started with the flood. See, we know that there's corruption on earth, and God decides that the way to deal with this corruption, the way to heal the world from this corruption, is by bringing the flood. It was a worst case scenario, unfortunately. Nothing was changing. People were not correcting their ways, and they were just being horrible people one to another. It had nothing to do with how they treated God. It was more how they treated each other. Because we know 10 generations later, 9 generations after the flood, people rebelled against God, but God did not bring another flood. The issue here was that people couldn't treat each other properly. So God brings along the flood to heal the world. Now, because this flood is going to destroy everything in its path, God tells Noah, you and your family, I'm going to save them. We're going to replant and restart civilization. But we also need animals. So God says, I need you to bring from all the tahora, from all the pure animals, I need you to bring 7 sets of each animal. So 7 males and 7 females of every kosher animal, of every behemoth tahora. And then he says, from the non-kosher animals, I need you to bring 2, 1 male, 1 female. And the same thing is when it comes to birds, not just animals, that to bring 7 female and 7 male kosher birds, or birds that are pure, and 1 male and 1 female non-kosher bird. And like this, once the flood is over, you'll be able to replant and restart civilization. Now, why so many kosher animals and so few non-kosher animals? So Rashi, the French commentary from the 11th century, right away points it out. This is, don't worry, it has nothing to do with Jews, non-Jews, has nothing to do. It says first things first, the word tahora, which means pure. What do you mean? Well, animals were pure or impure, especially back then. So Rashi says first things first, we know that Noach learned the Torah, because over here the Torah is talking about when the Torah eventually be given to the Jewish nation, kosher animals will be called pure animals. So we know that Noach was exposed to the Torah, and he knew which animals were kosher, which ones were not. Secondly, the reason why the kosher animals, there had to be so many of them, is because when the ark would finally rest on dry land, and Noach would come out of the ark, come out of the teva, he would sacrifice animals to God as offering thanks to God for saving him, humanity, and the entire world. And that's why there had to be so many kosher animals which could be brought as sacrifices. Okay. Now, does anybody notice a little bit of a nuance or something unusual about the terminology, how we are referring to kosher and non-kosher animals? All right, let's go further for now. It'll come up in a moment. You see, generally when the Torah refers to non-kosher animals, the Torah will use a different terminology than we just saw. Until now, we saw the animals which are pure, the animals which are not pure. Now, later on in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, when the Torah will go through what a Jew is allowed to eat and not allowed to eat, it talks about all different animals. We have to know that there has to be split hoofs and it has to chew its cud. Because the Torah says an animal that is missing one of them, so for example, the camel, which chews its cud but does not have completely split hoofs, is called tameh, unclean. Or the same thing with the hyrax, the same thing with the hare. We see that the Torah refers to them as animals which are tameh. Now, if you think about it for a moment, you go back to the story of the ark, and the Torah says, "Habehema tahira, vasher einena tahira," that which is pure and that which is not pure. Over here, the Torah says clearly, instead of using the terminology of tahira, einena tahira, not pure, the Torah calls it what it is and says tameh. Right? You can't be something. You can't say I'm not this. That's not a definition. To say an animal is not pure is not a proper definition. To say an animal is impure or unclean by calling it tameh, that is a proper definition. So what's going on over here? We said that the Torah uses an extra 8 letters to say the words eina tahira, which means not pure, as opposed to just saying impure, which is tameh or unclean, using one word. You see, whether we're going to use brevity as a way of communicating, or we want to use clarity, either way, the Torah should have used the word tameh, the terminology of tameh, in the story of the flood. So why does the Torah use an extra 8 letters to say eina tahira, that which is not pure, that which lacks purity? Now, many of you might look at this Like, yeah, this is semantics. Who cares? Does it really make a difference? The point is the same. However, we know that the Torah is God-given, directly from heaven. The Torah is God's intellect, wisdom, will, and understanding. And if that's the case, God doesn't make mistakes. There's nothing random in the Torah. Every single word is precise. Every single letter is precise. And if that's the case, where did precision go? Which is the better terminology to use? And what's the theory behind using a different terminology? Now, you see, it's not just the letters which are extremely valuable and the words which are extremely valuable. Even the crowns on top of the letters are extremely valuable. The Talmud tells us how Moshe Rabbeinu, when he went up on Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, he witnessed how God was finishing up a Torah scroll, filling in crowns on top of several letters. There are actually 7 letters in the Torah that have crowns. And Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, sees God filling in these crowns. And he says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm putting crowns on." He says, "What's the significance of these crowns?" Moshe says. And God says, in the future, Akiva, the son of Yosef, the famous Rabbi Akiva, he will learn mounds upon mounds of Jewish law and lessons based on every single crown in the Torah. So we see how precise the Torah is, not just with its wording, not just with the letters per word, but even the crowns on top of the letter. But if that's the case, what's going on over here? You can see that picture is clear enough to see the crowns. If that's the case, what's going on over here? What happened to following a system and being precise? Why in one place does the Torah use the terminology, in the case of the flood, that which is not pure, using an extra 8 letters, versus in the case of when the Torah tells us which animals we are or are not allowed to eat, the Torah uses it up the word straight up, tummy. It's 3 letters, tes, mem, aleph. What does this teach us? So the Gemara right away picks up on this nuance, as it always does, and tells us as follows. The lesson that we can learn from this is that a person has to be very careful not to speak or say anything in a crude way, because we know that the Torah distorts its terminology by using an extra 8 letters. Instead of saying the word straightforward, impure, or tummy, the Torah understands that to be not refined, and therefore uses an extra 8 letters and says that which is not pure, in order to teach us that valuable lesson of how important it is to say things in a refined fashion, refined manner. Similar to the Lubavitcher Rebbe was famous for using the term not good as opposed to the term bad. And just think about it. Imagine telling a child that is bad as opposed to telling a child, that's not so good. Which one is crude? Which one is refined? Now, the glaring question over here is, that's very nice. We're not going to use any of these terms, but what about the fact that the Torah itself, so many times, at least 100 times, if not more, uses the word tummy? In other words, if this whole idea is to use extra lettering and extra words in order to bring out that we have to speak in a refined manner, that would be very nice if it was consistent. But there are over 100 times that the Torah uses the word tummy and says it clearly, straight out. So what happened to the rules of speaking in a refined fashion? Where did they go? So is there really a lesson to be learned? Seemingly it's just inconsistent. All right. So they tell the joke of the Russian immigrant to Israel. He escapes the Iron Curtain, the refusnik. He's famous. So the Israeli newspaper wants to come and talk to him and find out what it was like in communist Russia. So he asks him, he says, what were the living conditions? He says, I couldn't complain. He says, no, honestly, what were the living conditions like? Tell me about it. Explain it. I want an expose. What were the living conditions like? He says, I couldn't complain. He says, okay, what was livelihood? What was your income like? How did the government treat you? He says, I couldn't complain. He says, okay, what was the deal with food, hunger, famine? What was it like? Did they really give you what you needed? Didn't they give you what you needed? What was going on? He says, I couldn't complain. And he goes on, he keeps pushing him, and he keeps saying, I couldn't complain. So finally, he says, I don't get it. If everything was so fine and dandy, why did you want to get out of there? Why did you want to come here? Where were you running? He says, what didn't you get? In Russia, we couldn't complain. See, in American society, we value freedom of speech. First Amendment right, the freedom to express myself. And we know how strong of a value to the core of American society, Western society, freedom of speech. In truth, the concept of freedom of speech being a human right predates America by hundreds of years. It goes back to the times of the Athenian law, or the Athenian democratic principle of the freedom of speech, which goes the 5th or 6th century before the Common Era. So this is nothing new. This is something which is ingrained within a human being, the freedom to express one's opinion, the freedom to express oneself, but mainly the idea of freedom of speech guarantees one that freedom, even if it's against a higher governing power or those who hold the power. And it nevertheless allows everybody else to be able to express their rightful opinion. Now, notwithstanding the First Amendment and this right to freedom of speech, we know that there are exceptions to the rule. For example, shouting fire in a crowded movie theater and causing chaos and damage, if there is no fire, does not fall under freedom of speech. Any time that a person's speech will cause direct harm or curtail somebody else's freedom, then there's a limit on the person's freedom of speech. Now, besides for the court's limitation on freedom of speech, there's also the societal limitations on freedom of speech. What was accepted 10 years ago in society, for somebody to say it today, they would be shunned for saying it, because society has come to grow and accept that certain things are unacceptable, even if legally one is allowed to say them, because we recognize that it's just not right. Not that it just doesn't sound right. It's just not moral. It's not ethical. It's not a way a refined person, a human being, should be speaking. These are words that can hurt people. From this whole conversation, this whole concept, that's what we're dealing with today, with the whole idea of political correctness and the spectrum on it, and the debates, the hot debates of how far do we take it, what is political correctness, what is it not. But you know what? There's a lot of room for this debate. It's a very necessary debate, but the fact that there is a debate, it in itself is beautiful, because that shows that we're sensitive to the idea and the power that speech holds. As long as we don't come the thought police. Anyways, what does the Torah have to say on the subject? Ideas like this. You see, the Torah tells us, which means, and you shall not wrong one man his fellow Jew. What does it mean to wrong? So based on context and based on the Talmud, the commentaries explain as follows. This is talking about lashon hara, saying negative things about somebody else. To slander somebody else is a biblical prohibition. To say negative things, to spread rumors about somebody, be they true or false. Biblical prohibition. Because as important as freedom of speech is, another person's dignity as well is important. And therefore the Torah says, no way. You can't just go around slandering someone. You can't just go around spreading lies about somebody. You can't go around verbally attacking people. You may have the freedom of speech, but only to a certain extent. Now the Torah takes this next level. This is from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. The Rebbe lived in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Writes as follows: even when it's just an implied attack on somebody. For example, if you're going to say something in front of somebody you know will embarrass them, but it's even more than just embarrassing them in public, as we're going to see in a moment. But if you're going to publicly ask somebody something you know they don't know the answer to, and the only reason why you're asking them is to harass them, then what would you respond here? Or what is your opinion on this matter? And you know that they're completely underdeveloped in this area. And this will cause them shame. This will be a source of harassment. That is what the Torah is talking about. That is biblically prohibited. So we see what kind of great care and sensitivity, according to the Torah, one must take when it comes to using speech. Speech is a tool that we're granted, but we have to be extremely careful with how we use it. We must use it with compassion and sensitivity. Now, in addition to that, another area of speech is telling lies. Midvar shaker tirchak. One must never tell a lie. Now, obviously, to both of these rules, when it comes to slandering someone, and it comes to telling a lie, are there exceptions to the rule? Yes. But the rule of thumb is generally, we always have to tell the truth. We're never allowed to slander someone or spread rumors, be they true or false. Now, the question is, do we have to tell every truth? Do I need to spread every belief that I hold with the entire world? Do I have to make sure everybody knows about it? Do I have to sit down at every meal and bring up every controversial topic that I feel like I have developed an opinion on it because this is my truth? So, in the world of freedom of speech, of course I have to make as much noise as I can. I have to spread as much controversy as I can, and I have to make sure that everybody is entitled to my opinion. The Torah says otherwise. Are you being compassionate? Are you being sensitive? Are there lies being spread? Let's be extremely careful. Weigh your speech extremely carefully. But now, okay, but I have truth to my words. There's something I want to spread. Well, how am I supposed to go about it? Now, this is definitely not strictly a legal matter, and definitely not black and white. But there's a beautiful saying from the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe brings the name of the Alter Rebbe, and he says as follows: "It's forbidden to utter falsehood. Truth, on the other hand, needn't always be broadcast and publicized from the roofs." Not everything needs to be said. Right? Truth is extremely important. Falsehood is never accepted. But not every truth needs to be broadcasted. Sometimes you can get away without saying anything, or you can be a little bit diplomatic, as we like to say. You see, when it comes to, there's a concept called the fifth part of the Shulchan Aruch. You see, the Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish Code of Law, is actually split up into 4 areas, 4 sections. The first section, which deals with day-to-day life and the holidays and Shabbos. The second section, which deals with kosher matters, family matters. A third section, which deals with matters of marriage, matters of inheritance, and the like. And a fourth section, which deals with money matters, monetary matters between one person and another, sales, properties, etc. But in order to apply any Jewish law, you have to have human understanding, sensitivity, intuition, and common sense. And that's all found in the 5th volume of the Jewish Code of Law called Common Sense, which, as we know today, unfortunately, is very uncommon. As to bring out this idea of using the common sense, there was once a woman who came to the rabbi right before Pesach, and we know that on Pesach we have 4 cups of wine by the Seder. And she asked the rabbi, says, "Rabbi, can I use milk if I don't have wine? If I don't have wine, can I use milk?" The rabbi looked at her. He says, this is a very difficult question. I will have to look into it. And he sent her home. He said, I'll send you an answer. Sends her on her way. As soon as she leaves, he turns to his helper and he gives him a bag of coins. And he says, go buy meat and wine for this woman and her family. Because he understood that if she was asking if they can use milk instead of wine, not only did they not have money for wine, they didn't have money for food to have their Yom Tov meal. And he made sure that she had what she needed. And that's why a rabbi, before he takes on the position and the role of being a rabbi, must do something called shimush. Where he accompanies a rabbi in just to witness the way a practicing rabbi works, the way a practicing rabbi deals with people and understands people. Based on this, when it comes to the idea of talking about truth, spreading ideas, there also has to be this consideration for 1 second. I need to use my common sense. Just because it's true doesn't mean it needs to be broadcasted from the roofs. Just because I have a point doesn't mean that every time I sit down for dinner with someone, or every time I meet a person in the marketplace, I need to start a full-out war, an argument, just in the name that I have a truth that I need to share with the world. At the same time, that doesn't mean always being quiet, as we'll see. Now, because of this, just a few points that are very healthy to take into consideration when one wants to spread the truth. One is, can your audience, the people who you're talking to, the person you're talking to, can they handle the truth? There are times where a person just can't handle the truth. And spreading the truth to them at that moment, enlightening them, if you want to call it, can be counterproductive. Why? Because they're just not there. They're just not ready to accept it. And that's okay. Another idea is timing. You might be able to handle the truth. And you're going to come along and you're going to be ready to enlighten. But if the timing is off, if they've had a bad day, they've just went through something rough, it's not the time. It's not the place. Understand that. So take that into consideration. Ask yourself, is now the right time to be telling the person this? And thirdly, am I the right person? We may hold truths. We may recognize certain truths that we want to share with people. But not always are we the right person to be sharing that truth. Maybe if somebody else were to share it, the other person might accept it a lot nicer and a lot better. And it might be a lot more meaningful and impactful. A story which brings out this concept. My wife's great-grandfather, Rabbi Yochanan Gordon, was a rabbi in a shul in New Jersey in the 1940s and 50s. You have to understand, Judaism then, at least what the world thought, Judaism was on the decline. They thought that Judaism would not last. There was a study put out, I think by Harvard University then, if I'm not mistaken, that by the time the 1990s came, there'd be very few religious Jews left. They were wrong, but that's besides the point. So you can understand what kind of community he was dealing with. He was a pulpit rabbi, and he had an extreme dilemma. If he spoke truth, he would hurt people. People would not come back. People would not listen. So it would be counterproductive. But on the other hand, if he didn't speak the truth, he'd be watering down his message. He'd be watering down Judaism for these people. So what was he to do? He had a private audience with the previous Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who came to America in 1940. And he told him as follows. The previous Rebbe says, have you ever gone to what's called the Schwitzbad, which is like the sauna bathhouse back in Russia, back in Europe? And he says, sure. He says, what goes on over there? He says, you sit in the sauna a little bit, you warm up, you relax, and then the person comes in and they use these huge, long reeds and they whack you. And it feels good, and you say more and more, and the person continues to whack you. And then you go and you sit, you relax a little bit more, you call the person to come back and to whack you again. He says, and it feels good, the body releases everything. He says, let me ask you a question. If you were walking down the street and somebody walked over you with the same reed and started whacking you, would you say more, or would you run and scream? Or would you not turn around and knock them in the face? Yeah, it wouldn't be very pleasant. He says, what's the difference? What do you mean? In the bathhouse, that's the place for it. You sit down, you relax, you get comfortable, you warm up, and then you call the person over. He says, exactly. That's how you have to go about it with them. He says, you might have a truth. They might need to hear that truth, but you have to find the right time. You have to find it when they're willing to accept it, and then you can give them the truth. And he said, not only will you be able to give them the truth, they're going to say, we want more. Tell us more truth. So we have to be very careful when it comes to communicating truths or beliefs, that it lines up and falls into this category. Okay. Now, there are times that we have to know that silence, like Shimon, the son of Gamliel, once said, I have found nothing better for the body than silence. Sometimes silence is golden. Silence is the best solution sometimes. Now, obviously there are times to spread and times to keep silent. Now, what about those moments where we do have to spread? We do have to say something. We do have to stand up for our convictions and our beliefs. You see, there seems to be this narrative that truth and sensitivity are mutually exclusive. I'd have to be fully honest with you with an extreme bite of truth, or no, I can't tell you the truth. But that's false. That's wrong. The Torah shows us that it has to be done together. You can stand up for what's right. You can stand up for your convictions and for truth. At the same time, being sensitive and compassionate. The Rebbe used the term, the Lubavitcher Rebbe several times used the term, which means with appropriate force in a pleasant manner. Appropriate force means standing up for what's true, speaking the truth. But in a pleasant manner means, what kind of tone will you use when communicating that truth? Will you smile? Will you be compassionate to the other person? Will you leave space for the other person? Just because you're sharing the truth and standing up for your convictions doesn't mean you don't need to leave space for them. There's a certain rabbi I know, almost every time he makes a point, he ends off with, I think. And that kind of doesn't always work, but a lot of the time, it makes it a lot easier for the other person to accept what he just said, because he's not saying that this is the ultimate and the only truth and the only way of looking at it. He's saying, I think it's my perspective. That means you have your own perspective, and that's okay. I'm just sharing my perspective and leaving room, opening room for your perspective. We have to be very careful. It doesn't mean that we can't be confident. We can't be assertive. We can, but not aggressive. And there's a very fine line between the two. So you see, at moments we do have to share the truth, but it must be threaded with the needle of compassion. Now, back to the original question that we had. Sometimes the Torah uses the term, that which is not pure, in order to be less crude and more refined. And sometimes the Torah uses the term tameh, straight out, impure, which is to a certain extent crude and less refined. So why the difference? See, if you can split the Torah into two general categories, the Torah would be split up into stories and history, laws and lessons. The entire Torah, whether it's the story of Abraham and the kings that waged war, whether it's Jacob and his brother Esau, whether it's about the Jews going down to Egypt, whether it's about the great flood, or Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, during the sin of the tree of life. These are the stories that the Torah tells us. Or about the Jews wandering in the deserts for 40 years. Another story. But then there are areas where the Torah gives us clear commands. Like when it comes to putting on tefillin, when it comes to wearing tzitzis, when it comes to keeping the Shabbos. These are the commands of the Torah. Or what a Jew can eat and what a Jew should not eat. Now, when it comes to giving over the ideas, the laws of the Torah has to be clear and concise. Don't leave room for misinterpretation when it comes to giving over a law. You don't want somebody to walk away with the wrong idea. And therefore, what is the primary concern? That is the clarity of the message. Secondary is the refined speech. However, when the Torah comes to tell us a narrative, a story, to teach us a general life lesson, over there the Torah can give primacy to the idea of giving a sensitive message, the primacy to refined speech over the clarity of the message itself, because the message is more of a general concept over here as opposed to a specific set of rules. Now, this doesn't just belong to the 5 books of Moses, to the Torah itself, but we find this even in response from late 1800s, early 1900s, Rabbi Yisachar Shlomo Tachtel. And he writes as follows. He says, there are those who ask me whether it's the proper practice that a lot of rabbis, instead of saying that something is treif, which is the general word, treifa, which is general for something which is not kosher, they use the terminology es is nit kosher, es is nicht kosher, it's not kosher. So should they be saying that? Should they be saying clearly kosher or treif? He says, in my opinion, es is nicht kosher, to say that it's not kosher, sounds nice, it sounds refined, it's less blunt. He says the problem is somebody might walk away. They didn't hear the not. All they heard is it's kosher. Broken telephone happens all the time. He says, therefore, when it comes to giving over laws and directives, you have to be clear. You have to say it's treif. It's impure. And that's the idea. And that's how we reconcile that contradiction. Now, in conclusion of everything that we've said, we see that we have to have extreme sensitivity for other people when using our speech. We have to minimize negative talk, to speak in a refined way, so that the message comes across without attacking somebody else, and that in general, just to use a refined method of speech. But the truth is, on the speaker themselves, there's a huge effect in the words that we use. Give me an example. In Israel today, when a person goes to a hospital or refers to a hospital, there are 2 ways of referring to a hospital. Is it a Beit Chalim, which means a house of the sick? Or is it a Beit Refuah, a house of healing? They're both true, and you'll find different people using both terminologies. But one gives a message of positivity, one gives a message of negativity. Another example of this, there was a fellow Rabbi J.J. Hecht, lived in Brooklyn, passed away late 80s, early 90s. And he used to be the MC of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Lag BaOmer parade. You see, on Lag BaOmer, the Rebbe fell out on Sunday. They would close off Eastern Parkway, and there'd be a huge parade. And Rabbi J.J. had to do a lot of things for the Rebbe. But one of the things he would do was be the MC. He said one year he was just broken, depressed, depleted. And he started off, he was very sluggish. He was very broken on the inside. And he said when the Rebbe came out, the Rebbe gave him a smile, the Rebbe's presence, and it just completely warmed his heart, got him out of his rut. And he had an amazing day. At the end, he said thank you to the Rebbe. And he said to the Rebbe in Yiddish, thank you, Adain, as Rebbe Hakmir Arois Geschlepp. Rebbe, thank you for schlepping me out. And the Rebbe looked at him and says, Arois Geschlepp? Schlepped you out? Aufgehoben. I uplifted you. You see, to schlepp has negative connotations to it. It means you're a burden on me, but I did you a favor. The Rebbe says that's not the case. I uplifted you. This is what I want to do. This is not a burden on me to help you out. This is what I'm here for. I'm here for you, and you're not a burden on us. If you're ever going to help someone out, they say, sure, I'll schlepp it for you. Yeah, exactly, sure, you're a nudge, and I'm going to help you so I can get rid of you. He says, no, of course I would love to help you. See the difference in terminology right there? Here's a letter that the Rebbe wrote, Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote in December 1980. And this was to the major conference for the Jewish community on issues and needs of Jewish retarded. And this is way before the world realized that using the terminology retarded was not okay. And the Rebbe writes that clearly in this letter. And the Rebbe says, I prefer some such term as special people, not simply as a euphemism, making people feel good or whatnot, but because it would more accurately reflect their situation, especially in view of the fact that in many cases, the retardation is limited to the capacity to absorb and assimilate knowledge. While in other areas, they may be quite normal or even above average. The Jewish identity factor is even more important, not only per se, but also for its therapeutic value. You see, everyone was saying, let's not just use terminologies to define people, especially when they're not completely true. But they also marginalize them. They bring out negative ideas and negative aspects to it, which just are not true. And the Rebbe says, use a different terminology. In 1976, a large group of IDF soldiers who were IDF veterans, really, who were injured in battle, came to New York. And while they were in New York, they visited the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And this became a regular occurrence. One year, a fellow named, in 1976, a fellow named Joseph Kabilov was in the crowd. And the Rebbe spoke to the crowd about the fact that the world calls them disabled. Many of these people were missing limbs, arms, legs, severely burnt, broken physically, emotionally. And they would be called disabled. And the Rebbe says, I don't like that terminology. I'd rather use the term exceptional. See, when you call somebody disabled, you're alienating them. You're separating them from everybody else and saying that they don't have the ability to accomplish. They don't have the ability to grow, to be regular people, or to be a person. And the Rebbe says we want to call them special or exceptional. That's the term the Rebbe used. At the end of this, each soldier passed by the Rebbe, and the Rebbe gave him $1 and said something. And Joseph Kabilov, who lost both his legs, passed by the Rebbe. The Rebbe turned to him, gave him the $1, and said, thank you. Joseph said, these two words carried him for the rest of his life. Until this point, he was completely broken. Not just physically. He says, I got over the fact that I lost my legs and I learned to use my arms. He even became part of the paraplegic team in Israel. But he says, I felt marginalized by society. I felt like an alien because I was disabled. So automatically, that meant I couldn't accomplish, that meant I couldn't do anything. When the Rebbe called this exception, and the Rebbe thanked me for my services, that gave me my life. You see, when it comes to using words, it's extremely powerful. Yeah. Facts are not always black and white, especially when it comes to our opinion of others, their behavior, their lifestyle, and so on. Ultimately, beauty or the lack thereof lies in the eye of the beholder. We have to be extremely careful the way we communicate ideas, the way we say things, to use the most positive terminology possible, to minimize any negative terminology. Always speak in a good way and use good terms. And this isn't just semantics. This can be the difference between hope and despair, success and failure. Think about it. If you use the term that, oh, I'm not good at this, versus, oh, I'm not good yet. Imagine a kid who's just learning how to play baseball, learning how to play basketball, learning how to draw. And the kid walks around thinking, I'm not good, versus I'm not good yet. Which one is actually going to do better? Or if a person does something, they make a mistake, they did something wrong, and they think, oh, I am bad, versus I did bad. Who's more likely to improve? Who's more likely to be more successful? The Talmud tells us that the only part of the body that has two gatekeepers is the tongue, the two lips. And that's because we're supposed to realize the power that our words hold. Be extremely careful with how we use our words. And sometimes we may need to use our lips to control, to think about what it is we're going to say. Make sure we're going to say the right thing.